The day I found the apartment key, my husband told me it was nothing, just a storage unit, just a place to keep extra furniture, just another small investment. But what he didn't realize was that I already knew the truth. Because the key wasn't the first thing I found. The first thing I found was the receipt. My name is Natalie. 2 years ago, I thought I had a normal marriage. Not perfect, not dramatic, just stable. The kind of relationship people settle in after 10 years together. Routine dinners, weekend grocery trips, occasional vacations when work allowed it. My husband Mark worked in real estate development, which meant he was always talking about property, buildings, investments, neighborhood growth, the language of square footage and future value. For most of our marriage, I didn't question any of it. Why would I? Real estate people always have keys, always have contracts, always have properties they're evaluating. It was just part of the job. Looking back now, that was the perfect cover. The receipt appeared on a Tuesday evening. I was cleaning out Mark's jacket pockets before doing laundry, something I had done 1,000 times before, and a small folded piece of paper slipped onto the floor. A payment confirmation, electronic lock installation, Ridgewood Apartments, Unit 12B. I stared at it for a moment, because we didn't own any property in Ridgewood, at least none that I knew about. When Mark came home that night, I asked him directly, "What's Unit 12B?" He barely hesitated. "Just a storage place." I held up the receipt. "For an electronic lock?" Mark shrugged casually. "Safer than a normal one." His explanation sounded reasonable, maybe even convincing, but there was one small problem. The address on the receipt wasn't a storage facility. It was a luxury apartment complex, and something about that detail stayed in my mind long after the conversation ended. The next morning, I drove past the building. Ridgewood Apartments was newer than I expected. Glass balconies, underground parking, the kind of place young professionals move into when they want to look successful. I sat in the car across the street for almost 10 minutes, watching people come and go, thinking about Mark's explanation, storage unit. Then a woman walked out of the building, blonde, early 30s, carrying a small overnight bag, and when she stepped onto the sidewalk, Mark's car pulled up beside her. He leaned across the passenger seat and opened the door. She smiled, got in, and they drove away together. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to, because suddenly the apartment made perfect sense. Mark didn't have a secret storage unit. He had a secret life. But the most interesting part wasn't the affair. Affairs are painfully common, predictable, almost boring in their selfishness. No. The interesting part was the apartment itself, because when I went home that afternoon, I checked something I hadn't thought about in years, the property records, and within 5 minutes, I discovered something fascinating. The owner of Unit 12B wasn't Mark, at least not directly. The property was registered under a small holding company, a limited liability corporation, and the name of the corporation looked very familiar. It was the same company Mark had created years earlier, the one we used to manage rental income, the one that technically belonged to both of us, which meant something very interesting. Mark believed the apartment was his secret, his private escape, his hidden space to build a new life with someone else. But legally speaking, that apartment belonged to me too. And the moment I realized that, a very different kind of plan began to form, because Mark thought he had built a perfect hiding place, a private world where his affair could exist safely, where no one would interfere. But what he didn't realize was that the property he was using to hide his betrayal was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. And by the time he discovered what I had done, the apartment he thought belonged to him would already be gone. Once you discover a secret, it becomes impossible to ignore it. Every small detail starts connecting. Every excuse suddenly sounds rehearsed. And the more you pay attention, the more the truth reveals itself. After seeing Mark pick up that woman outside Ridgewood Apartments, I didn't confront him, not yet, because confronting someone too early only teaches them one thing: how to hide better. Instead, I started paying attention. The first pattern appeared within a week. Mark suddenly had late meetings every Thursday, always around the same time. Before the receipt, I would have believed him. After the receipt, the pattern was obvious. So the following Thursday, I drove back to Ridgewood Apartments. I parked across the street again, far enough away that no one would notice, but close enough to see the entrance clearly. At 6:47 p.m., Mark's car appeared. He parked in the underground garage, used a key card to enter, and disappeared inside the building. 10 minutes later, the same blonde woman I had seen before arrived. She didn't hesitate, didn't buzz an intercom, didn't call anyone. She walked straight into the building, like someone who lived there, which meant two possibilities. Either she owned the apartment, or Mark had given her access. Both answers told the same story. I stayed in the car for almost an hour, watching the building, watching the lights in the windows, trying to imagine what was happening inside Unit 12B. Eventually, I drove home. Mark arrived 3 hours later. He looked relaxed, almost cheerful, the kind of calm that comes from someone who believes their secret life is safe. "How was your evening?" I asked casually. "Busy," he said. "Meetings ran late." Of course they did, but now I had confirmation. Thursday nights weren't business meetings, they were date nights. Over the next 2 weeks, I repeated the same routine. Thursday evening, same building, same woman, same apartment, and eventually, I learned her name. Her name was Olivia. I discovered it by accident. One night, when Mark left the apartment building, he stopped to talk with the concierge. They laughed about something, and the concierge said, "Tell Olivia I said hello." Mark smiled. "Will do." Olivia. The name followed me all the way home. That night, after Mark fell asleep, I opened my laptop and started searching. It didn't take long. Olivia Carter, marketing consultant, 32 years old, works for a small advertising firm downtown, and according to her social media, she had moved into Ridgewood Apartments 6 months earlier. 6 months, which meant something interesting. The apartment purchase had happened exactly 1 week before Olivia moved in. Mark hadn't just rented a place for his affair. He had built one, a private apartment, a secret location, a hidden life. And because the property was owned by our shared holding company, he believed I would never question it, which was almost impressive. But the more I studied the property documents, the more something else became clear. Mark had made one critical mistake. He assumed I didn't understand the company structure, but the holding company wasn't complicated. We had created it years earlier. To manage rental income from a duplex we used to own, both of our names were listed as directors. Both of us had legal authority to manage its assets, which meant something very simple. If I wanted to, I could sell the apartment, legally, without asking Mark's permission. The idea didn't appear all at once. It started as a small thought, a possibility. But the more I considered it, the more perfect it became, because Mark believed that apartment was his escape, his future, the place where his relationship with Olivia could grow safely. He had invested money in it, time, emotion, and most importantly, confidence. Confidence that the space belonged to him. But what Mark didn't realize was that the apartment he was using to hide his affair was actually the weakest part of his entire plan. And the moment I decided what to do with it, the ending of this story became inevitable. Because while Mark was busy building a secret life, I had already started preparing the moment it would disappear. The idea of selling the apartment didn't come from anger, not at first. Anger is loud, impulsive. It makes people act quickly, and quick reactions are rarely strategic. What I felt instead was something quieter, curiosity. Because the more I studied the property records, the more I realized something fascinating. Mark hadn't hidden the apartment from me legally. He had only hidden it emotionally. Our holding company still worked exactly the way it always had. 2 directors, 2 authorized signatures, 2 people legally allowed to manage the assets. Mark assumed that because he handled most of the property deals, I never paid attention to the paperwork, and for years, that had been true. But the moment I logged into the company account, I saw everything. Mortgage documents, ownership filings, property management agreements, and sitting quietly among them was the purchase record for Unit 12B, a luxury apartment, 2 bedrooms, corner unit, city view, the kind of place someone might buy if they wanted a private life away from their spouse. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney. Not Mark's attorney, someone new, someone who had never worked with us before. Her name was Julia, and after reviewing the documents for 20 minutes, she leaned back in her chair. "So," she said, "your husband bought an apartment through your shared company, and he didn't tell you." "Correct." Julia raised an eyebrow. "And you want to sell it?" "Yes," she smiled slowly. "That's actually possible." I felt a strange calm settle over me. "Explain." Julia tapped the document. "You are listed as a managing director." "Yes. And the company bylaws allow either director to authorize property sales. So legally," I said, "I can sell the apartment." Julia nodded, without his signature. There was a long silence in the office. Then Julia asked the obvious question. "Does your husband know you know about the apartment?" "No." She leaned back in her chair again. "Then I assume he also doesn't know you're planning to sell it." "No." Julia smiled again. "Well, that will make the closing very interesting. But before anything could happen, I needed to confirm one more detail. Was Olivia actually living there? Because selling an empty apartment was simple. Selling one occupied by your husband and his mistress was something else entirely. So the following Thursday, I returned to Ridgewood Apartments. Same car, same parking spot across the street, same quiet observation. At 6:40 p.m., Mark arrived. At 6:55 p.m., Olivia arrived, and at 7:03 p.m., they walked into the building together, not like 2 people meeting secretly, not cautiously, not nervously, comfortably, like people who live there, which meant something had changed. This wasn't just an occasional meeting place anymore. It was becoming their home. 3 days later, I confirmed that. I followed Olivia one afternoon, not far, just enough to watch where she went. She left her office building around 5, stopped at a grocery store, bought 2 bags of food, then drove straight to Ridgewood Apartments. No overnight bag, no hesitation. She walked inside with groceries, like someone who expected to cook dinner. And suddenly, the plan became even better. Because if Mark and Olivia were treating the apartment like their home, then selling it would do more than embarrass them. It would evict them. That night, I called a real estate agent. His name was Daniel, and he was very enthusiastic when he heard about the property. "Corner unit?" he said. "High floor? City view?" "Yes." Daniel laughed. "That will sell fast." "How fast? In this market?" He paused. 2 weeks, maybe less." "Perfect." We listed the apartment the next morning, and the most interesting part was that Mark never noticed, because all the paperwork moved through the holding company, the same way every other property transaction had for years. Emails, digital signatures, listing agreements. To Mark, it looked like normal company activity. Just another investment decision. But inside Ridgewood Apartments, something else was happening. Olivia was decorating. I saw it one afternoon when the listing photos were taken. The photographer opened the door to Unit 12B, and inside, the place looked very lived in. Fresh flowers on the counter, clothes hanging in the bedroom, a half-empty wine bottle on the table. Someone had turned Mark's secret escape into a real home, which made what happened next even better, because 3 days after the listing went live, Daniel called me. "We already have an offer," he said. I smiled. "Accept it." And just like that, the apartment Mark had bought for his affair no longer belonged to him. He just didn't know it yet. The offer came faster than I expected. 3 days after the listing went live, Daniel called me early that morning. "We have a buyer," he said. Not a maybe, not someone thinking about it, an actual offer, full price. Apparently, the market for luxury apartments in Ridgewood was hotter than anyone predicted, and Unit 12B had something buyers loved: corner windows, a skyline view, and a price slightly below comparable listings. Mark had bought the apartment as a long-term investment, which meant he had priced it conservatively, which meant selling it now was incredibly easy. The buyer's name was Daniel Hartman, a software executive relocating to the city, single, no complications, and most importantly, very motivated. He wants to see the unit in person, my agent told me. Of course he does. Normally, that wouldn't matter. Real estate showings happen all the time. 10 minutes, a quick walk through, maybe a few questions. But this situation was slightly different because the buyer believed the apartment was empty, and inside that apartment, 2 people believed it belonged to them. I stared at my phone for a moment. Then I said the only logical thing: schedule the showing. The agent hesitated. "There's one small issue." "What?" "The building concierge says someone might be staying there occasionally." I almost laughed. "Occasionally?" "That won't be a problem," I said calmly. "Use the access code." Because the electronic lock installed on the door was still registered to the holding company, which meant the agent had full access. The showing was scheduled for Thursday evening, 6:30 p.m., which was perfect, because Thursday evening was Mark's favorite night to visit the apartment, at 6:15 p.m. I parked across the street from Ridgewood Apartments again, the same place I had watched from before. Mark's car was already there, which meant he was inside. 6 minutes later, Olivia arrived, carrying a bottle of wine and a paper bag from a nearby restaurant, date night. Inside the building, they probably believed they were safe, hidden, invisible. But 10 minutes later, Daniel, the real estate agent, arrived with the buyer. 2 men walked through the front doors. The concierge nodded politely, and the elevator doors closed behind them. I stayed in my car, watching the building, waiting, because upstairs, something very interesting was about to happen. The agent reached the door of Unit 12B, typed the access code, and the electronic lock clicked open. Inside the apartment, Mark and Olivia were in the kitchen. Later, I would hear the story from the agent himself, but even without seeing it, I could imagine the scene perfectly. The door opening, 2 strangers stepping inside, and Mark turning around in shock. "What the hell are you doing?" Mark asked. The agent blinked, showing the property. "The property?" Olivia said. "What property?" The buyer stepped further into the apartment, looking around, admiring the view, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in front of him. "This is Unit 12B, right?" the buyer asked. "Yes," the agent replied. Mark's expression changed instantly, confusion, then anger. "This apartment isn't for sale," the agent frowned. "It absolutely is." Olivia looked at Mark. Mark looked at the agent. "No," Mark said slowly. "This apartment belongs to me." The agent pulled out his tablet, opened the listing. "It belongs to Ridgeview Holdings," he said, "and Ridgeview Holdings listed it this week." The silence in that apartment must have been incredible, because Mark understood something immediately. Only one other person had authority to list that property. Me. "Who authorized the sale?" Mark asked. His voice sounded different now, quieter, dangerously calm. The agent glanced at the tablet again. "Natalie Carter." Olivia turned slowly toward Mark. "Natalie?" she asked. "Your wife?" Mark didn't answer, because the truth had just arrived. Across the street. I saw Mark's car door slam open 20 minutes later. He walked out of the building fast, angry, phone already in his hand, and right on cue. My phone rang. "Mark?" I answered. "Natalie," he said, his voice shaking. "What did you do?" I leaned back in the car seat, watching the city lights flicker on around us. "I sold the apartment." Silence, heavy silence. "You can't do that." "Actually," I said calmly, "I already did." Inside the building behind him, a buyer was walking through the living room, admiring the skyline, discussing renovation ideas with the agent, and the apartment Mark had built for his affair was no longer his. When Mark called me from outside Ridgewood Apartments, I could hear the panic in his voice. Not anger, not yet, panic. The kind of panic someone feels when a plan they believed was secure suddenly disappears. "You sold it?" he said again. "Yes." "You had no right to do that." I watched him pacing on the sidewalk across the street, running his hand through his hair, looking back at the building like it had personally betrayed him. "I absolutely had the right," I replied calmly. "The apartment belongs to the company. And I'm a director of that company." Mark didn't answer immediately, because he knew that part was true. "What about the buyer?" he asked. "They've already made an offer." And I accepted. Silence again. Longer this time. He was doing the math in his head, trying to figure out if there was still a way out. "There must be a way to cancel it," he said finally. "Not really. Contracts are signed." Mark swore under his breath, then said something interesting. "Olivia lives here." I almost smiled, because this was the first time he said her name out loud. No more pretending, no more storage unit, no more vague excuses. "I know," I said. Another pause. Then he asked the obvious question. "How long have you known?" "Since the receipt." Mark stopped pacing, completely still now. "That was months ago." "Yes." "And you said nothing?" "No." Mark laughed quietly, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was disbelief. "So you've been planning this?" "No," I said. "I've been watching." Behind him, the front door of the building opened. Olivia stepped outside. She looked furious. "Mark," she said sharply, "what is happening?" He turned toward her, still holding the phone, still trying to process the situation. "The apartment was listed," she said. "The agent says it's sold." Mark didn't answer. Olivia crossed her arms. "Is that true?" "Yes," I said into the phone. Olivia froze, because she realized immediately who I was. "Is that your wife?" she asked quietly. "Yes." Olivia looked at Mark, then at the building, then back at Mark again. "You told me you owned this place." Mark hesitated, which was the worst possible thing he could do. "Well, technically." "Technically what?" Olivia snapped. Mark looked exhausted, cornered. "It's owned by a holding company." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "And who owns the company?" Mark didn't answer, because the answer was standing on the other end of the phone. "Both of us," I said. Olivia went very still. "You're married?" Mark closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Apparently, that detail had never been fully explained. Olivia looked like someone who had just discovered an entire story had been rewritten. "You told me you were separated." Mark didn't answer. "And you said the apartment was yours." Still silence. Then Olivia laughed, but there was nothing amused about it. "So let me understand this," she said. "You're married. The apartment belongs to you and your wife, and she just sold it." "That's basically correct," Mark said quietly. Olivia stared at him for a long moment. Then she said something that ended their relationship instantly. "You lied about everything." Mark tried to speak, but Olivia shook her head. "No, I'm not doing this." She walked back toward the building, then stopped, turned around, and delivered one final line. "Good luck explaining this to your wife." Then she disappeared inside. Mark stood alone on the sidewalk, phone still in his hand, across the street. I watched the entire scene from my car. Finally, he spoke again. "You planned this perfectly." "No," I said calmly. "You did." "What does that mean?" "It means the apartment you bought for your affair." I looked up at the building one last time. "Just paid for my new house." Mark didn't respond, because he understood something now, something simple, something brutal. The secret apartment he thought would protect his affair had become the most expensive mistake of his life. The closing process moved faster than anyone expected. Apparently, the buyer for Unit 12B had been looking for months. The location was perfect. The price was right. And once the contract was signed, there was no turning back. The official closing date was scheduled for 30 days later. 30 days. That's how long Mark had left before the apartment stopped belonging to him entirely. For the first week after the sale, the house was strangely quiet. Mark barely spoke. He came home late, left early, spent long hours staring at his laptop like he could somehow reverse the paperwork. But the truth about real estate transactions is simple. Once the contracts are executed and the escrow process begins, the deal moves forward, no matter how much someone regrets it. One evening, he finally said it out loud. "You knew exactly what that place meant to me." I looked up from my coffee. "Yes. And you still sold it." "Yes." Mark rubbed his temples, like someone trying to push away a headache. "That apartment wasn't just an investment." "I know. It was a place where things were different." I nodded slowly. "A place where you could pretend you weren't married." Mark didn't respond, because that was exactly what it had been. 2 weeks later, Olivia called him again. I wasn't meant to hear the conversation, but Mark had forgotten to close the office door. "I need to know something," Olivia said through the speaker. "Did you lie about anything else?" Mark sounded tired. "What do you mean?" "You told me you were separated." "I thought we would be." "You said you owned the apartment." "I did, through the company." "And you said your wife didn't care about the company." That part made me smile slightly, because clearly that assumption had not aged well. Olivia exhaled sharply. "Mark, I'm not interested in being part of someone else's divorce drama." He tried to say something, but Olivia cut him off. "I thought you were leaving a complicated marriage." "I was." "No," she said quietly. "You were hiding one." And with that, she hung up. That was the last time Olivia ever contacted him. 30 days passed quickly. On the morning of the closing, Mark didn't go to work. He sat in the kitchen staring at the final documents, the same documents that transferred ownership of Unit 12B to the new buyer. I signed the paperwork calmly, digitally, the same way we had signed dozens of property transactions over the years. But this one felt different, because when the final confirmation email arrived, Mark looked like someone who had just watched a door close forever. "It's done," he said quietly. Yes. The apartment is gone. Yes. Mark leaned back in the chair, looking at the ceiling. That was supposed to be my escape. I considered that for a moment, then answered honestly, "You already had an escape." "What do you mean?" "You could have told the truth." Mark didn't respond, because honesty had never been part of his plan. The divorce happened 3 months later. It was quiet, professional, almost strangely peaceful. The money from the apartment sale was divided according to the company agreement. Half went to Mark, half went to me. But what Mark lost wasn't the money. It was the illusion that he had built a secret life no one could touch, the illusion that he could control the story, the illusion that the apartment was a safe place for his affair, because in the end, the very thing he used to hide his betrayal became the tool that exposed it. Sometimes people ask if selling the apartment was revenge, if it was my way of hurting him back. But the truth is simpler than that. I didn't destroy Mark's secret life. I just sold the property it was built on, and once that foundation disappeared, everything else collapsed on its own.